it's actually great to see so many people logged into this. This is fantastic, and I also think it's sort of indicative of how much interest is in the space. I'm certainly seeing a lot of it here in DC. So thank you, Stefan, for that. It's great. I mean, a lot of what you have just sort of gone through, I think, really dovetails nicely with some of the points or messages that I'd like to leave the audience with today. And before I really jump into some of those points, again, do want to say thank you to Zim2 for not just the opportunity today to come and share some ideas and thoughts, and hopefully challenge some of your beliefs, because I am, just to cut right to the chase, I am quite bullish on this thematic, whether or not you want to call it electrification or what have you, but out over the next 10 years. And so I do give Zim2 actually a lot of credit for leading the charge through thick and thin, and including me on those bus trips, despite the fact that, yes, Dave, you're right, they do blend together, and there's a lot that I don't recall from those bus trips, which is probably another story for another day. But nevertheless, let me go ahead and just share my screen and jump in here. Okay, here we go. So one of the things that can you guys see all that? Okay, good. One of the things that I've tried to do in 2021 is not use PowerPoint. And so this is my attempt at talking more from like a bullet point perspective. But I think we, just in terms of a general framework about where we are with rare earths and critical metals, I look at the global economy and some of the points we'll get into here in a minute. I look at today right now as what I call the cell phone moment. Okay. And I sort of came to this by going back through, taking a trip down memory lane in my own memory. And in 1987, when this actual, what you're looking at here is a picture from the movie American Psycho, which is about an investment banker in the mid 80s. And so I thought it was an appropriate picture because back in 1987, this was cutting edge technology. Okay. And of course, between 1987 and 2007, we saw this technology get more and more powerful and become more and more accessible. Okay. And of course, in 2007, the iPhone was introduced and we're off and running. And so when I think about, personally 1987 as the tipping point for personal communications, I think that today, 2021, is the cell phone moment, if you will, for electrification and for the use of the battery and the use of magnets in particular with respect to transportation. And so those are some of the points I'd like to lay out today. I do think that, going forward, I think the next 10 years is going to be characterized by what I like to call the paradox of green growth. Okay. I really agree with all of Stefan's points and his take. I mean, I think nobody that I know, no matter how skeptical you are of green tech, nobody that I know doubts that demand for rare earth elements, in particular, the magnet feed, is going to grow. Okay. And it's going to go strongly. And you're looking at this interesting situation where we all want technology, we all want a higher quality of life, but the problem is it's not going to take less rare earth elements. In other words, my personal bet is that the typical magnet in 2030 won't necessarily use less of a given rare earth element. The percentages and the weights might be slightly different, but overall, we're going to be using a lot more rare earth elements to electrify the global economy. And so that's the paradox. How do we bring more supply on stream while still managing a number of these bullet points that I'd like to just run through over the next few minutes? And so the first, as you can see here, is geopolitics. Last year, right as COVID really hit New York, my family and I moved to Washington, D.C. It was more a quality of life move, but nevertheless, it's been a really interesting time to be in D.C., given the fact that, as you can see here, the line between economic and national security, in my view, has permanently been blurred. The typical Chinese strategy, I think, is to combine both economic and national security. And what I see happening, whether or not it's here in North America or in Europe in particular, with stimulus and a lot of the focus on critical elements, is this Chinese strategy of this blurring of national and economic security becoming the norm over here. It's interesting that I think the only thing you can get people to agree to on here in Washington, D.C. is that China is the bad guy. Okay, their strategy of sort of top-down investment, economics are secondary, the environment is secondary, just own the means of production at all costs, has rubbed a lot of people the wrong way and certainly hollowed out the manufacturing base here in the West. And that's something that I think is clearly going to change. And that leads into my second point, which is this focus on supply chains. Again, about a year ago, this topic of supply chain and supply chain resilience and independence from China, I think, became very, very popular, and it still is today. My view is that despite the fact that it's probably going to be inflationary, meaning more expensive for typical producers of the supply chain overall to run business and not touch China, it's something that is going to happen. I don't know about the whole deglobalization thematic and how realistic that is, but I certainly think that within the next 5 to 10 years, you could see a regionalized supply chain structure, whether or not it's with critical materials or PPE or other things like that, medical equipment, that really avoids China to every extent possible. I think there's enough capital flowing around in the system, something we'll talk about in a minute, but also just the sentiment, the realization that this is something we can actually do. And so again, how that happens is really the $64,000 question. My view is that it's going to be public and private partnerships. So the government is going to play an increased role in the build out of these supply chains, whether or not it's focusing on rare earth elements or what have you. The EU Green New Deal is a perfect example of something that I think needs to be worked out a little bit more in terms of how all of this money, this public money, is going to be spent. But we're talking about spending €1 trillion on their own domestic supply chains around critical materials in the next 10 years. I mean, that's unprecedented and it's incredible. And I'm just interested to see how and where that money gets dispersed. The same thing with Biden, President Biden and his plans on infrastructure here. I mean, he's talked very openly about 174 billion US dollars focused on the electric vehicle supply chain. Again, that's an outrageously large amount of money, for lack of a better phrase, but how it gets passed through Congress and then spent is another question. Department of Defense grants, things like that we've seen with Linus, and of course energy fuels and neomaterials, lots going on there. So supply chains are going to change, and I think that they're going to change because of these geopolitical tensions that I really don't see abating anytime soon. And then just the last two, one of the interesting sort of I don't want to call it curveballs, but maybe additions here to supply chains is that it's not enough to bring new upstream capacity on. It's not enough to build magnet recycling. All of this has to be done with ESG goals in mind. Okay, and that is because literally every economy, every country on the planet is now focused on not just the decarbonization angle, but also supply chain transparency. I mean, many of us on the call are familiar with cobalt and what does or does not go on in the DRC in terms of bringing it to market. And my personal view is that, again, coming back to this paradox of green growth, or this tension around what we want and what we're willing to do to bring it to market, it's going to be a situation where the supply chain transparency is going to be, I think, ultimately going to win out. In other words, having eyeballs on how the material is mined and produced in Canada or in the United States or in Western Europe is going to outweigh the potential low cost of outsourcing a lot of that, which has been the traditional model. Okay. Now, it could mean cost inflation for domestic producers, whether or not it's rare earths or what have you, but ultimately, ideally, domestic producers of these raw materials could pass that cost inflation onto their customers. The implication there is, of course, higher pricing, which works well on the equity side as well. Okay. And then just to follow up or maybe finish up, and then I'm happy to take any questions or perhaps hear what some of the companies have to say. I think that the macro economy has emerged from COVID, or is in the process. Maybe we're not out of the woods yet, but it's emerged much stronger than I think a lot of people would have guessed a year ago. When you look around globally, for all the hand-wringing and talk of inflation relative to deflation in the economy, I think interest rates in terms of the cost of money, the cost to borrow, are still very, very low. Okay. And capital, I would argue, is still plentiful and cheap. Many of you on the call may or may not be familiar with what a SPAC is. That's a special purpose acquisition company. That is essentially one method of capital raising and going to the public markets to bring new deals to market. I call it a boom, and I have a bust in parentheses because last year, actually in 2020, about 80 billion US dollars was raised in these SPAC deals. Okay, and just to put that in perspective, today, year to date, here we are, what is it, April 21st, about $93 billion has been raised for SPAC type of deals. I think the most notable SPAC deal that many of us would be familiar with of late is MP Materials. And they're one of the only, upstream recipients of SPAC capital. But look, there's a lot of money out there sloshing around in the system looking for a home. And my central argument is, as we're looking to build out these supply chains, it's one method for these companies to tap the public markets. Of course, COVID era stimulus, I referred to this earlier around supply chain development. I mean, there's just an unprecedented amount of stimulus in Western Europe, in the United States, in Canada, all over the world, looking for a home. And my view is, what better home than building out our own domestic supply chains to increase our own self-reliance. And then finally, again, the question that I get on a lot of these calls is, from a macro perspective, what's winning, or where do we go in the future? Is it inflation or deflation? And I have been pretty publicly I don't want to say I'm in favor of deflation, but I think it's still the predominant force out over the next 10 years. When you look at demographics globally, when you look at how technology proliferates, again, that cell phone example is only one of a number of different examples. I just think that cost deflation and leveraging technology is going to win out over the next 10 years. And so, again, the speed of technological diffusion, I think, is going to be one of the major themes to keep in mind, whether or not you're building a junior mining company or you're investing in it. Those companies that I think have world-class assets, world-class teams, that can also leverage a lot of the technologies out there, whether or not it's producing rare earth elements with ESG sort of friendly processes in mind. I do think that those are the companies that are going to be well placed and are going to be pretty fortunate, maybe recipients of capital going forward. So again, this is just a little bit not off the cuff, but I think that these are the themes and the ideas that are really going to drive the critical metals supply chain over the next 10 years in North America, but in particular, I think the rare earth supply chain as well. I know Chris Grove he's probably forgotten more about rare earths than many of us will ever know. So, Chris, I'm interested to hear what you have to say with respect to China and commerce when it's your opportunity. But, China is still the big question mark, I think, geopolitically right now. Are they importing rare earth elements? Yes or no? To what extent? I mean, a lot of this information is starting to come to light. And again, it just makes the case for, in my view, a domestic or regionalized supply chain. And we're not talking about hundreds of thousands of tons a year, right? Starting small and then scaling with the market, I think, is the way to do it. But again, just a few thoughts. Again, happy to take questions today or in the future. But again, thank you all for your time and attention. It's actually great to see so many people logged into this. This is fantastic. And I also think it's sort of indicative of how much interest is in the space. I'm certainly seeing a lot of it here in DC. So with that, I will step aside. And again, thanks for all of your time and attention.